As we wind our way through the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, we've already explored love, which I believe is the root that allows all of that fruit to grow, self-control, at the other end of the list, as the one that keeps all of them from gross distortion, and joy, which is the word used in Greek for grace when it is fully received in us. The Greek word for peace in the New Testament has a meaning as broad as the word does in English. It's used biblically in the context of war, smaller conflicts between individuals and families, the quiet of an undisturbed part of the natural world, or the inward peace of our own souls. All of that, same word for all of it. Today's passage comes from the letter Paul wrote to the church he established in the Greek city of Philippi. You can read about how that church got started in Acts 15 and 16 if you're interested. This section from the final part of the letter helps us understand the kind of peace that Paul is talking about. First and foremost, he's talking about the peace of God. In the Gospels, Jesus makes a distinction between the peace that comes from God and the peace as more generally understood in the world. In John 14, verse 27, Jesus is speaking to his disciples for the last time before his arrest, trying to give them what they will need in the days, the months, and the difficult years ahead. And Jesus tells them, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." The peace that the world gives is the absence of open hostilities. Where that kind of peace exists, it's often an enforced or even coerced peace. We send military troops as peacekeepers. It should be obvious, but if it takes a military presence to keep the peace, then likely there isn't really peace underneath all of that. It's the suppression of violence through the threat of violence, which might be necessary in some of the messes that we get ourselves into. But we degrade the word to call it peace. Real peace on any level is only achieved when there is equal justice for all involved. And then you have natural peace that springs from the bottom up and not squashed from the top down. A ceasefire can be a huge relief, but that too is not peace. If the time of the ceasefire is used in good faith to justly address the issues that led to the conflict and then whatever ensued during the fighting, a ceasefire can help bring about peace. But just stopping the open conflict is not, in and of itself, peace. A peace treaty isn't even peace if it forces one side to accept an injustice that is never redressed. The treaty then is just a mechanism for suppression, which will force the conflict underground until there's a new opportunity to erupt. Jesus said he wasn't talking about that piece of the world that satisfies itself with the suppression of open conflict in whatever way that happens. He offers something different to his disciples, which we would call inner peace. It's that same inner peace that Paul is talking about in his letter to the church in Philippi. Importantly, Paul is also writing with the knowledge that his time is short. From the start of the letter to the Philippians, we know that Paul is writing from prison. Paul was imprisoned a couple of times, about a decade apart, And there are debates about whether this was from the first time he was in prison or the second and final time. I'm in the camp that believes this is the second time, when he was in prison in Rome before his execution, mostly because the tone is similar to that of Jesus right before his execution in the passage I read from John, and which goes on for a couple of chapters. Both are giving parting pastoral words to a community of people that they love. Also common to both Jesus and Paul is their knowledge of what lies ahead for those who hear their words. Both of them know that they are about to be executed by the empire for teaching and practicing their faith. But they also know that rounding up and executing the leaders is only the first step. Those persecutions will spread to all in time. As I said a few weeks ago, during the lifetime of Jesus and Paul, Israel had experienced independence for a mere 73 of the past 1,000 years. All the rest of that millennium, they were occupied and controlled by a succession of empires. That brief period of independence had been stolen by the Roman Empire just a few years before Jesus was born. Both Jesus, who was not a Roman citizen, and Paul, who was a Roman citizen, understood that empires eventually come for everyone. Indeed, according to the traditions of the church, the only one of Jesus' 12 closest disciples who did not die a martyr's death was John. And within a decade of Paul's writing, the churches that he founded would be either slaughtered or driven underground for the next 200 years. It's that larger context that makes the words of both Jesus and Paul about some kind of inner peace more than just feel-good language. It's also that context, both facing their own executions, that shows both of them mean something very different than freedom from want or suffering when they talk about rejoicing and having peace. Jesus warns his disciples of what's coming so often that Peter pulls him aside in Matthew 16:23 and tells him to stop talking like that. Nothing bad is going to happen, Jesus. Don't say that. Jesus replies, "Get thou behind me, Satan." Says that to Peter. In the first chapter of Philippians, Paul indicates that those in the church in Philippi are already feeling the walls closing in. He writes in Philippians 1:29 and 30, quote, "For he has graciously granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but of suffering for him as well, since you are having the same struggle that you saw I had and now hear that I still have." Suffering as a privilege. The main purpose of the letter to the Philippians is as a thank you note for a gift the church has sent to Paul. We don't know, not told, what the gift was, but it was something to make his imprisonment more bearable. In the thank you section, which closes out the letter and comes right after the passage that Kim read, Paul writes this: "I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I'm referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share in my distress." Back in John, That same idea continues from John 14 through the end of John 16, when Jesus explains why he's telling his disciples all of this about how to have peace and the importance of loving one another in difficult times. This is John 16, the first 4 verses. I have said these things to you to keep you from stumbling. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, an hour is coming when those who kill you will think that by doing so they are offering worship to God. And they will do this because they have not known the Father or me. But I have said these things to you so that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you about them. And then again at the close of the chapter in John 16, verse 33, Jesus says, I have said this to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage. I have overcome the world. Having peace listed in Galatians as a fruit of God's Spirit implies that the first step of cultivating peace, like everything else on that list, comes from our open embrace of the Spirit that lies within all of us. You can't grow the fruit without first obtaining the seeds. The good news is that the seeds are free. The harder news for us to accept is that the free gift can't take root in hostile soil. Until we recognize that there is, in fact, a power far greater than ourselves, that vanity will choke off the growth of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and all the rest of the things on that list. But, like in any garden, the right condition of the soil is just the first of many things needed for seeds to be able to sprout and grow. It seems clear to me that for both Jesus and Paul, the fruit of peace they have found for themselves, and hopefully their followers can also gain, requires a facing of reality. Peace doesn't come by pretending something isn't happening or by imagining that God will magically prevent horrible things from impacting our lives in awful and tragic ways. That's been a long-held idea. Witness the book of Job, where that's on full display. And it's an idea that's widely pervasive in the United States, and it has baffled me my entire life. We wear a cross around our necks, like a cross with some kind of luxury recliner. The believe in Jesus and nothing bad will happen to you idea is true until one day it isn't. Some churches teach that Jesus suffered so we don't have to. I totally understand why that's a popular idea. I would love it if that were true, but it doesn't stand up to 10 minutes of Bible reading. Both Jesus and Paul after him were imprisoned and executed. And both of them, as they sent out final words to those they loved, told them to buckle up, to prepare for persecution and hardship, and they were right. The solace that they promised was not freedom from suffering, but a peace that passes any kind of understanding in the midst of that suffering. The promise of Easter is not that death doesn't happen. It's that death is not the end of the story. And the promise of the kind of peace that Jesus offers is that in and through whatever comes, we can sustain ourselves no matter what life brings. The peace of Christ is not living in some kind of bubble where bad things only happen to other people. It's facing reality and deciding on what our own faithful response will look like when that suffering comes for us. We can find the courage to do that because others from Jesus on down, as well as the faithful before him, have also done it, and we have their stories. And because the promise of our faith is that God goes with us, even as Psalm 23 says, when we walk through the valley of the shadow, even when a cross has our own name on it. But Paul's advice on cultivating peace in times of terror doesn't stop with merely facing the reality of what's coming or the pain when it arrives. Those two things are necessary, but they won't cultivate the peace of God by themselves. Paul emphasizes 4 practices in what Kim read that can bring peace in and through all of it. The first was how it began: rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Remember from last week, the word for joy is the word for received grace. To rejoice is to look around for the gifts that God has given us, however small, and to see them for what they are, the little signs planted everywhere that God is with us. Seek and you will find, Jesus says. The gifts are everywhere if we have eyes to see them. Number 2, pray. Paul writes, "In everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." As we are thanking God for the gift we just discovered, there is nothing at all wrong with asking God for what we need in whatever detail we need to ask for that. You should hear the things I ask for. There is no guarantee that we'll get it. Even Jesus was told no when he prayed in the garden for, is there a plan B, God? Can we, not do this cross thing? And the soldiers showed up right afterwards. If Jesus can be told no, we can be told no. But sometimes the answer is yes. Or, well, that's not going to work exactly that way, but how about this good thing instead? The Lord's Prayer, the model for all prayer that Jesus gives us, includes asking for things. Don't lead me into temptation, please. Give me food today, my daily bread. Deliver me from evil. How about that? Yes, would like that very much. Pray, ask, give thanks is Paul's second bit of advice. Number 3, while we can't prepare either wisely or faithfully without being willing to acknowledge reality, once we've done all we can do, we can focus on what is good. Mr. Rogers always told children in crisis to look for the helpers. As a Presbyterian Christian minister, Fred Rogers was simply teaching children Philippians 4, verse 8, which says, "Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Again, that doesn't mean do that instead of recognizing the danger around us. When the house is on fire, you don't focus on lovely things until you get everybody out of the house and call the fire department. It also doesn't mean watching a neighbor's house burn and focusing on how blessed we are that it's not our house. If we just let it burn because it's not our house, it soon will be our house. Fred Rogers' advice to adults in a crisis is to be the helpers that the children can look to and learn from and find peace in. And if we have to put our own lives in danger to alleviate the suffering of others, we can find peace in the midst of that real threat by focusing on the fact that we are acting justly, we are doing something commendable and worthy of praise. And in that same vein is the fourth thing. Quote, keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul was not a perfect human, and his pre-conversion life is a good example of how helpful human traits can become warped to evil ends when not infused with love. But by the time Paul was facing his final hour, the fruit he laid out in Galatians, which is often considered to be his earliest letter, had matured and ripened. As he tells the Philippians in the next paragraph, he has now been through it all. Quote, in any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul found the secret of peace in the midst of trials of the most extreme kind, and is sharing how he found that with those he loves. That secret is to love as God loves and to walk faithfully in that way. And even though there's a cross in that way, on a hill we will all be required to climb, if we stay on the path nonetheless, the peace of Christ will guard our hearts and our minds, and as the song says, we will walk through the storm with our heads held high and won't be afraid of the dark. As one example of what this looks like in today's world, I'll close with a portion of a newsletter called Easy by Nature that I get every week from Bill Davison, who's an award-winning wildlife photographer, biologist, farmer, and birder. This came from this past Friday's edition as he was taking pictures of possums near his Illinois home. And as he was doing so, he was alerted by friends driving by that there were whooping cranes in the lake nearby. He writes, a few hours earlier, the cranes had sailed down out of the clouds, elegant white birds coalescing out of sky. They descended into what is normally an 8-foot deep lake, but was now a mere shadow of itself. 6 inches of water, stretched thin across exposed lake bed. The juxtaposition was jarring in its poignancy. These luminous birds, living monuments to the theater of evolution and the love of generations of dedicated crane conservationists, wading through the dwindling waters of our collective short-sightedness. The view before us contained beauty and devastation in the same frame, like joy and grief occupying the same heart. The lake's dramatic recession tells a story written in the language of absence. Absence of native prairie, absence of wetlands, absence of foresight. The watershed, once a complex living system that gathered and slowly released water through an intricate network of roots and soils, has been reduced to a simplified equation. Rain arrives, drain tiles expedite its departure, and nothing remains to hold moisture during increasingly frequent droughts. Despite all of this, a pair of whooping cranes are casually foraging, preening, and resting in 6 inches of water in a relatively secluded part of Lake Evergreen. They held the light of the setting sun as the world darkened around them. Their red crowns and black feathers surround yellow eyes that fire like the sun. Grace and an aura of wildness precedes them. They are native to this place. They are still part of a delicate ecology, awaiting a chance to reanimate the landscape. They remind us that we are still part of the song of the earth. Its rhythm calls us to reimagine ourselves, to step back into the family of things and mend what we have broken. We have erased too much life. But we have the same light in our eyes as the cranes. The same wildness and grace lives within us. That is why they resonate with us. That is why we will reimagine our place in the family of life. Davison then describes identifying the bands on the legs of the cranes, marking them as a mated pair that winters in Alabama. And then he continues to the end. This recognition reinvigorated my commitment to wetland restoration, not just for cranes, but for the entire community of life. To advocate for wetlands is to advocate for resilience, for systems that can absorb disturbance and maintain function in a world of accelerating change. The work of wetland restoration invites a little slice of heaven to drop out of the clouds and settle into clear blue water. The cosmic drama of existence has always unfolded through themes of love and loss, joy and sorrow, creation and destruction. Our challenge is not to resolve these tensions, but to hold them with gentle awareness, to recognize the profound gift of bearing witness to both the wounds and the wonders of our world. All we can truly do is orient ourselves toward the light of possibility, toward a hope that springs from our determination to act regardless of the odds. For in this leaning toward the light, in this trust in our capacity for goodness, we participate in the ancient ongoing work of creation itself. And goodness, patient and persistent as those cranes returning season after season, prevails in the long arc of time. It always has, it always will, not as a guaranteed happy ending, but as a perpetual invitation to begin again. Amen. Peace.